I think we have a doozy of a morning set in front of us. It's a technical theological term, a doozy. I've just been feeling just weight on the topic at hand this morning, since last night, actually, as I was thinking. And it's just such the passage here, Romans 8 in general, the book of Romans has been called probably Paul's most, hear me when I say this, the most generic theological letter that he writes, because it covers all the bases. And he's writing, ostensibly he's writing to a church he has not yet visited when he writes Romans. And so you hear when he writes, say, the first letter to the church in Corinth, he's addressing specific things that have happened when he was there. But in Romans, he writes in a very general sense. And so he gives us this broad overview that probably, and has been said again about the book of Romans, is that it really sums up Christian theology. And the thing is, so many things to say. We might be here for a while, by the way. The thing is, if we read the book of Romans, I'm gonna unpack this. If we read the book of Romans, Romans 7, Romans 8, last week I was referencing Romans 7 in context of Romans 8. It seems to me that we develop theological systems by looking at the epistles first and the gospels second. And we put primacy on the kind of terms that we find in Paul's epistles before we look at the gospels and look at what Jesus accomplished. And I think Romans 8 gives us prime examples of that. And so I feel like today, this morning, there's going to be some theological adjusting. I hope pretty much every Sunday there is. I mean, he's always adjusting me, right? Like we're constantly it's, the famous words of Yoda, right? To learn, you have to unlearn, right? That's not an exact quote from Master Yoda, but it's close enough. But there's so much when we approach this book that we have to let go of. So much that's been formed in us through culture of origin, through family of origin, through just the lens we've been given growing up. How many of you grew up in the church? I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, we glean things without realizing we glean things, and we're formed by culture. And culture can be a great thing. It can be a wonderful and beautiful thing, right? But it can be such a detrimental thing in teaching us how to think and how to see the world and how to see life. So let's jump into June 30th's life-altering message. Romans 8, 12 to 17. Therefore, brethren, we are debtors. This is in the New King James. I'm probably going to flip between a couple different translations to bring some context through the references that we go through. Romans 8, 12. Therefore, brethren, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. So we move from, remember last week we talked about the marriage picture that Paul paints, where he starts off Romans 7 talking about the law, saying if a woman's been married to a husband, when the husband dies, you're no longer married to that husband, and so the woman can marry another husband, and we've been married to Christ, right? He uses the marriage analogy throughout Romans 7, moving into Romans 8. And here now he's shifted gears a little bit because he's no longer using the marriage analogy, now he's using adoption. The term, and here's the thing, when and I don't want to get too far into this because we'll get into the weeds with it, but the term for adoption here is not really the same English term that we use. The term that's used in the Greek here has more to do with a supernatural effect that takes place. You become part of that family. Right? When we talk about adoption in contemporary English or contemporary North American culture, adoption is you have a child that's an orphan, does not have parents, and now comes into your family, and that child is never not adopted. Right? There's just practically speaking. The child is always going to have been an adopted child. And that I'm not saying that child doesn't become your child. I know we have amazing parents here in this church that have adopted children. That child becomes theirs. But there's no point in time where that child will not have been adopted legally, right? Culturally. When we talk about the English verb, that's what that means. Here in the Greek, it doesn't mean that. It means that something has taken place where that person has become part of the family that can only supernaturally happen. It's a different word than the actual word for adoption we use, but it's only the rough equivalent that we can use today. So we've been adopted, but that doesn't mean that we're always adopted. It means now we are full. This is why Paul says it. We are full heirs. Complete heirs. Right? Not just secondarily because we've been adopted, but you are part of the family. It's a different context. So while we can wrestle with these kind of concepts, we have to understand what he's trying to say here. And if we think, like when Paul is writing these kind of things, like look at this verse, right, where he goes, and this is, it's such an important verse for all of theology. We didn't receive the spirit of bondage again to fear. Okay, Paul is writing in a Jewish context connected with Jewish history, right? So this statement that he makes here, he's not just talking about slavery to fear in a generic, general sense. He's pointing them back to the Exodus. He's pointing them back to the narrative in Israel's history when they were slaves and they were afraid. So he's firmly rooting the experience of, you haven't been given a spirit of slavery, bondage, owing to fear. You've been given a totally new spirit. He's going, hey, all of that stuff you remember about Egypt, about the Exodus, and all this stuff that's hung over your head, about Babylon, all this stuff that's hung over your head, it's not like that anymore. So he's firmly rooting the conversation in Israel's history. And when he uses the kind of marriage analogy and adoption analogy, he's rooting his language in the language of Jesus. You know, Jesus' preferred manner of speaking of the kingdom was through familial language. The kingdom is like a wedding feast, a king who is going to marry his son, right? This is family language. The kingdom is like a prodigal son who left with his inheritance and squandered it, but the father welcomed him back. Right? This is family language. It's the preferred way that Jesus talks about the coming kingdom, is through the language of family. See, today we have a preferred, we'll just say this. Today, when we talk about the kingdom of God, sometimes we like to use warfare analogies. We talk about the great cultural fight we're in. We talk about how the political system is set up against us. Or the kingdom of God's going to come and it's going to change the land and all the laws are going to reflect the kingdom of God and the political system's going to come. We need to get political leaders in that are Christians, all this stuff, right? I'm not saying that's wrong. What I'm saying is we use this language about warfare when the preferred language of Jesus is family. We're a family. And Paul then comes into that and says, hey, you've been married to someone else. You're adopted into this family. So he's rooting his conversation with them in the person of Jesus and the language of Jesus. And it's a beautiful thing. It challenges our presuppositions. The kind of the first verse that gives you pause in this whole passage is, and this is where some of our presuppositions come into play. It's that very first phrase, therefore, brethren, we are debtors. We're obligated to something. What's his name? It's a great theologian. A.W. Tozer. There we go. It's there. My brain still works. He says, what you say about God will be the most important thing you say to yourself. What you believe about him. When we hear language like we are debtors, what is conjured up in your mind? Oh no. I've got an allegiance. I have to do this. I've got to do it. I've got to do it. I've got a debt to pay. Your view of the Father will determine how you read that verse. Your view of what he's like. Because sometimes we read that and we have an, oh no, I haven't done enough. Or, well, what does he expect even more out of me? I'd already given my life to him. Does he need all my finances? Does he need all my time? He's asking too much. Your view of the Father will determine how you see that word playing out. We are debtors. I want to tell you just a little story about myself. Story time with Josh. When I was in, I've told you many stories, but you guys know my parents divorced when I was 18, sent me careening in my life. And as most early 20-somethings who have discovered that credit cards exist, I really did not navigate that all that well. So you mean Best Buy will give me a credit card with a $1,200 limit, and I don't have to make a payment for 2 years? Like, that's just free money. So I royally hosed my credit when I was about 21, 22 years old. And the circumstances that I went through, I just made a mess of it. How many have ever made a mess of the financial situation, right? Especially at that point. And there was no, all the credit cards that I owed on all went to collection agencies, and I'd get letters all the time and calls all the time. And like I said, when about 21, 22. And then over time, I got better personally, but that debt never really left. I had a debt to pay. I'd forgotten about it, mostly because they'd kind of given up on calling me every day and sending me letters all the time. And I'd moved a number of times, so they probably didn't have my address anymore. And then I encountered Jesus in a really dramatic and profound way, and my life starts to radically change. And eventually I hear about this guy, John Paul Jackson, and I think, I want to go intern with that guy. I want to learn from him. And so I end up moving to Canada from California and do a year at the ministry school there, and I'm radically impacted. It's where I met Erin, my wife. We both didn't like each other at all when we first met each other. And there's reasons for that. Yeah, me. Yeah, thank you, Freddie. She had her problems too, okay, you know? I was one of those problems. And so then, you know, the so much change and transformation happens in my life, and I'm just like, I'm going to do this Jesus thing, and God, I think you've called me. And I go home for the summer. They've invited me back to participate in a leadership training program for a second year with Streams. This is 2007, 2008, summer of 2008. And so I'm home for the summer, totally planning my life is going back to Canada. It's going to be involved with this stuff, and God's going to use me, and we're gung-ho about it. And then I get a letter in the mail from a collection agency calling me to court over a $5,000 credit card debt. Actually, I think it was probably more like $7,000 at that point because of all the interest and all that stuff. And I hadn't heard anything for years, so I was hoping they forgot about me. And I'm going, I can't not pay this. I have a court date assigned. I have to deal with this. And I was crushed because, I don't have a whole lot of money to my name. How am I going to go up to Canada and pay the kind of tuition stuff I need to pay up there and then live and afford all the things I need to afford? I can't save any money up. This exhausts everything. What am I going to do? And so I basically, those moments where hope comes crashing down and there's nothing left. It's just kind of a pile on the floor. Like, well, I had a plan, I had a dream, and now it's dead. Lucky I have good people in my life that remind me that God is faithful and good. So I had a great debt I owed to these companies, and I was very stressed about how this was going to happen. And I was talking to a friend of mine and just expressing just the angst about the situation. And this friend was married, and I knew the person he was married to well. I'd known both of these people for a long time, but neither one of them were in the same place as I was with Jesus at all. One of them, this friend's wife, was a devout atheist. And actually pretty much hated the idea of God. And her husband was like kind of nominally raised in the church, but wanted to have nothing to do with the idea of God. And I was talking with them about this, just, talking about life and saying, well, I was going to go up to Canada, but I don't think I can anymore. I've got this debt. And we ended the conversation, and then a few days later, I got a call from the wife, the atheist, and they knew that I was planning on going to Canada to follow Jesus, and that was my life, and that was where I was going because I felt like there was a call on my life. God wanted to do something. And she called me, and she had just received an inheritance because her family, I think her mother had passed away, something like that. And she said to me, we're going to pay your debt for you so that you can go and do the thing that you dream about doing because we love you. I was stunned because there's no reason why this person should have given me the money to do the thing because the thing was totally opposed to their worldview. But out of their great affection for me, they wanted to see me pursue my dreams, and they said, we're going to give you the money. They said, if you get the money, if you can pay us back eventually, pay us back. But there's no obligation. We just want to invest in who you are in your future. Totally stunned. I still have somewhere in the files the note that she wrote when they sent me the check that says, this is obligation free. Handwritten note from her. She since passed away, actually, at a young age. It was quite tragic. But when I was reading this passage, I was thinking fondly about her. An atheist who hated God taught me something about the Father. I wish I could tell her that now. Because I have a debt. I had a debt to her and her husband. But that debt was a debt of affection, a debt of tenderness. Now, when I think about those two people, I think about how they enabled me to do the thing God called me to do. This is the kind of thing Paul's saying here. We're debtors not because we're so wicked, evil, and sinful. We're debtors because he's so loving, affectionate, and tender, and what he's done has transformed your life. So my obligation, actually the word for debt there can otherwise be translated as you are bound to this thing. Forever my destiny is intertwined with that monetary gift because I couldn't have done the thing that I'm doing now without that monetary gift. So I look back with great affection on that person because I have a debt to them. So the lens that you see the Father through will determine how you read verses like this. And the theological system that you've been given, whether you consciously realize it or not, because you're raised in a culture that teaches you something, it will determine how you see things like this, or at least weigh into it. You did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. You know, there was a study done by a psychoanalyst named Renee Spitz in the 30s and 40s, where Renee Spitz, he studied the effect of on infants when the primary caregiver is taken away from the infant through either loss of life or some other calamity, and specifically studied through the effects of World War II that had on infants that lost both their parents. And if a nurturing presence wasn't brought back into the infant's life within 3 to 5 months, it was almost impossible for that infant to recover later in life. They had difficulty maintaining relationships. They struggled with depression. They struggled with anxiety. Everything you can think about them struggling with, they did, because they grew up as an orphan without the tenderness and the affection of a mother and father. And many of them died because of it. Actually, he codified two or three different diagnoses when it came to what infants struggled with. Some of the infants could never recover. They lose weight. Like these are babies just respond, like you're still being fed and everything, but there was something so missing in their nourishment because they'd been orphaned. And the tenderness and affection had never been given. You know, that kind of puts in stark clarity what Paul's saying here, because he's been talking all about the affection of God coming to us. Remember, we talked about this last week. That heart transformation when it comes to the gospel is rooted in an affectionate embrace by the Father. And human suffering, studying human suffering bears that out. If we don't have that, it's very difficult to recover yourself. Here, let's look. We're just going to get into this, okay? I know. Turn with me to Hebrews 9. I just want to show you something. And then make a point. Hopefully, that makes sense. Hebrews 9. This verse radically shifted how I saw the Father a number of years ago. This series of verses, anyway. Okay, starting in verse 15. Hebrews 9, 15. 15, 16, and 17. And for this reason, he is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. Okay, so this is talking about Jesus, right? He is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. Verse 16, for where there is a testament, this is New King James, if you're reading ESV, it'll say a will, or NIV, it'll say a will. For where there is a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. The word there for testament is the word for will. It literally means the set of the document that would meter out someone's possessions after they die. So for where there is a will, so you guys know what a will is, right? And what does a will do? Say that again? Yeah, leaves your assets to a number of people. Whoever you define should have those assets. If you have the assets, it leaves them to the people, maybe your children, maybe friends, maybe, whoever you identify. People that you have a great affection for, typically, right? So a will in the context of Hebrews 9 is the same thing we would think of it as today. For where there is a will, and so how does a will come into effect? Yeah, somebody dies. Someone writes it out, right? Signs it first, and then they die. Well, this is exactly what Hebrews is saying right here. Right? This isn't rocket science. For if there's a will, there must also be the necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while they remain alive. Verse 18 there. Therefore, not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood. So who wrote the first covenant, the first testament, the first will? God, right? God did. Right? He writes the first one. Well, the first one is a promise with Adam and Eve, but he keeps renewing that, and then we have the Mosaic law tied into the covenantal promises with Abraham. So really the summary of the covenant that is being spoken of here would be in the statement that God speaks to Abraham. You will be my people and I will be your God. And so we have an inheritance based on what was written and the agreement between God and his people. And now an inheritance comes, right? Paul talks about this we just saw this. Paul talks about this in Romans 8, that if we've been given the spirit of adoption, we've been made sons, and if we're sons, then we're heirs, right? He just said that. We read that. So Hebrews is saying essentially the same thing. Okay, so if the person who made the will has to die for the will to be in effect, right? We've just said that and established that. And God is the one who wrote the will that Hebrews 9 is referring to. Who had to die for the will to be in effect? God. The one who wrote the will. God had to die. Because as long as the person who wrote the will is alive, the will can never be in effect. That's exactly what it says. Moses had long died. Abraham had long since died. Adam had long since died, right? The only one left alive was God, the one who wrote the will and who promised the inheritance. God had to die so that you would gain an inheritance. So, Romans 8, you've been given the spirit of adoption that cries out, Abba, Father, that you might be an inheritor. What's the inheritance? The spirit that cries out, Abba, Father. That's the inheritance. That you've been given the very nature of God. You're no longer an orphan, you're a child. That's the inheritance. God died for you to receive his nature. The thing he'd always promised would happen. So we have these conceptions about what God is like that have been given to us. See, here's the thing. I'm just trying to build a case here, okay? Turn with me also. There's another verse I want to look at. We'll wrap this up at some point. I told you it'd be a while. This is important. Turn with me to Luke 8. I'm going to make a really good point. I promise that you want to be here for this. Luke 8, verse 22. This is Jesus calming the wind and the waves. This is just one example I want to throw out there for you. It says this, "Now it happened on a certain day that he," being Jesus, "got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, 'Let us cross over to the other side of the lake.' And they launched out, but as they sailed, he fell asleep." Right? Very human thing to do. He fell asleep. And this is what I'm going to do this afternoon, Lord willing. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and the boat was filling with water, and they were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, 'Master, Master, we are perishing.'" How many of you have ever prayed that prayer? "Then he arose, and he rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was calm. But he said to them, 'Where is your faith?' And they were afraid and marveled, saying to one another, 'Who can this be? For he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him.'" Right? One of the renditions of this passage has Jesus saying, "Peace, be still." I've talked about this before. There's one of the children's Bibles my kids have. It says that the wind and the waves recognize the voice of their creator. Right? What you have is an example here of Jesus doing the kinds of things that Israel's God was expected to do. Was to speak to the wind and the waves and to have command and control over the weather. This happens multiple times throughout the Old Testament. Right, this is the Exodus narrative where he pushes back the waters. He sends a great wind to push back the waters. This is Elijah praying and the heavens opening up and rain coming down. God had control over the wind and the waves, over the weather. And you see Jesus here exercising control, and they go, "Holy moly, who is this?" Because it's starting to dawn on them that who's standing with them is God. Who they expect God to be is right there on the boat. The one who had to die so the inheritance would come into effect. See, we've been handed a theological system in 21st century Christianity that says God was so angry with his people that he sent a person to take the punishment for them. And somehow it makes it okay that he punished Jesus because Jesus is his son. So we've taken John 3:16, and rather than saying, "For God so loved the world," we render it as, in our theological system, "For God was so angry with the world that he sent someone where he could take his wrath out upon him and kill him." That's the system of thought most of us grew up with. On some level, we gleaned that. We've got an angry God who punished his son, so he's no longer angry anymore. And even sometimes it'll be characterized this way, is that, and you might have heard this before, that you've got the judge who's looking to punish all the people, and then Jesus stands in the way of the people and says, "I'll take the punishment for him." Because you've got an angry judge who's going to meter out punishment. If we have that view, then in Romans 8, when I say I've been adopted by that father, I don't want anything to do with his family. Because I know what that kind of father's like. Many of you grew up with broken fathers. And you read that kind of narrative in Scripture and you go, "Well, I don't want that kind of father. I don't want anything to do with him." That's called child abuse. And God gets communicated as a cosmic bully. The narrative the Gospels tell us is the story of a good God who came and won victory over the powers of darkness and freed you from everything that was holding you back. That's the narrative of the Gospels. Right? Everything else has to be fit into that. Jesus is God on the cross taking your punishment because you couldn't. This is God assuming every angle that wickedness could throw at him because you couldn't bear it. Because if you die, you die. But if he dies, he doesn't die. So you've been given a spirit of adoption by a good father who longs to make you his child. See, our presupposition about what the Father is like and the narrative the Gospels are telling us, sometimes because we have this enculturated thing, we see an angry Father that we've been saved from, and we're okay relating to Jesus because he took the punishment for us. But that's not the story the Bible tells. We just saw that in Hebrews 9. God came and died that you would be an inheritor. That's the story the Scriptures tell. Everything else has to fit in that narrative. So the Jews were terrified of God. They'd created this whole system to keep them safe from him. And Paul goes, look, it's not about fear anymore. You thought it was about fear. And in fact, actually, if you read Colossians 2, it's because the principalities and powers of the air co-opted the law that pointed to Jesus, that was to bring total redemption to all of creation. The devil co-opted the law and convinced the people they had to fulfill it, and were obligated to it and duty-bound to it. See, the law, like you probably heard this before, the law was designed to reveal your sinfulness. It wasn't. Paul says this explicitly. The law was designed to reveal Jesus. Everything points to him. The good God who wins the victory over the powers of darkness and death to free you from the bondage the world's been placed in. That's the story. That's the picture of the Father. That's what Paul's saying when he says you've been given this spirit of adoption. You're not been saved from an angry God. You've been saved from a dark world to know a good God. So as a debtor, I see the affection and tenderness of him, and I can't help but be thankful because I see what he's actually like. I'm not a debtor because he's so angry at sin. And so now I owe him my life because he took his punishment out on Jesus. That's not the theological system here. That's the linchpin, the theological linchpin that's done so much damage to Christianity in the 21st century is that belief. It's in our hymns. It's in our songs. But if we don't start with the story of the good God who won the victory over death, hell, and the grave, and we start with the wrathful God who punished his son, we end up in all kinds of error. I'm not saying that God wasn't angry over sin. I'm saying I have to come to grips with the good, tender God who came and gave himself for us before I can even incorporate this thing over here. I have to understand this, because if I don't, I'm going to read into this and go, I'm a debtor because I'm such a great sinner. No, I'm a debtor because he's married himself to me and he's made me a son, and it's amazing what he's done. That's why I owe him, because of his great love and tenderness. It's totally different, and we have to understand that, because that's what Paul's getting at. He's giving you the Spirit that pours the love of the Father into your heart. That's what Romans 5:5 says. And now you are not an orphan. You're not part of orphans form gangs and exclude everybody they can. That's not us. We're a family. We have a dad who speaks to us. See, this is the thing, okay? That orphan wants to come back in my heart every day. Every single day that orphan wants to come back. Every single day he's knocking at the door. You're not good enough. You haven't done enough. You're going to mess it all up. The reason you have this problem, is because it's all your fault. You're a terrible person. That orphan wants to come back every single day. So every single day, I have to turn myself back to the good, tender Father who pours his affection over me, who speaks identity and life over me, and it's all about him. Every day I have to be reminded of that. I can't not be reminded about that, because the orphan will come right back, and I'll be right in a gang, and I'll be attacking everybody around me. Because as an orphan, I don't belong. I have to prove my effectiveness. My worth comes from what I can do. So I've got to convince you that I'm so good. As a son, I rest in his embrace. I no longer strive. I'm content in wherever he has me. Whether I'm hidden or whether I'm seen, I'm content because I'm with him. If I'm an orphan, I struggle with it, and I go, I didn't get recognition for that thing. If I'm a son, I can celebrate that other people are seeing the Father. If I'm a son, I can see someone getting recognition at work, even though it was my work, and I can go, that's so wonderful that they're being built up. If I'm an orphan, I get mad that my boss didn't recognize me. Well, I should have been given that, right? It crops up in a million different ways. And then it leads to fear because I have to control the environment and I have to make my desired outcome. So I actually partner with the spirit of bondage, again to fear, and I create the environment so I get my desired outcome. And now I no longer trust. I've actually subtly removed myself from that place of sonship and adoption because I have to control the environment. Because I'm afraid, because I'm a slave, because I'm an orphan. And Paul goes, that's not the narrative anymore. You bought that narrative when you were being brought up, is what he's saying. You bought that narrative in your history, but it's not the narrative anymore. And he says to Timothy in 2 Timothy 1, you've not been given a spirit of fear, right? It's the same language. You've been given a spirit of love and of power and of sound mind. Right? Well, I want to characterize that this way. But that word sound mind literally means mental health. Right? You've been given a spirit that convinces you how loved you are, to empower you to think properly about yourself in relation to the world and to God. That's what he's been doing in you. The spirit that convinces you how loved you are to enable and empower you to see yourself as part of God's good creation in relation to a wise, loving, tender Father. Not a spirit of fear. But now my debt is, you're amazing. I can't believe you've done this. You're so beautiful. You're so tender. I want to be with you. I can't help but think back to the people that I owe and go, I'm so happy that even if you were an atheist who didn't believe in me, or didn't believe in God, I'm so happy you believed in me. And now I have an affection because of what they've done. That's the story Paul's spinning here. Not the story of your culture, your upbringing, your broken families, your broken fathers, your broken mothers, the ones who never gave you affection the way you needed affection to grow and to mature. Every one of us has that. Paul's going, don't go back to that place because you have a good, loving, wise Father who wants to lead you. It's like you read some of these verses and you go, in Romans 8 when he says that those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God, and you read this through the lens of an orphan and you go, oh no, am I being led or not? Because if I'm not being led, I'm not a son. That's the orphan talking. That's the orphan cropping itself back up, trying to convince you the narrative is all about what you don't have. Well, the Father comes and he goes, hey, by the way, but not before I say what the Father says, you were never enough anyway. So you just go, yeah, orphan, you're right. But that's why he gave me his Spirit, to show me his love, to empower me to see myself in relation to him. So that word for you've been given a sound mind, a spirit that leads to a sound mind, right? You can only have, biblically, you can only have mental health in relationship to a deity who is good, loving, wise, and kind. You can't have it any other way. I have a friend who's a family and marriage therapist down in the States, and he works with orphans and abandoned children. That's his expertise. He's been doing it for 30 years, and working with families that have adopted children. And he says, I can give you every tool under the sun to deal with anxiety and depression. The drugs, the breathing exercises, the calming exercises, all these kind of things. But I can never give you the Father's perspective because those are two very different things. I can have the right exercises to navigate stress and anxiety. But I can't, in a clinical perspective, give you the Father's perspective that deals peace to you for the rest of your life. That requires supernatural intervention. The good, wise, tender Father who speaks and forms and crafts his Spirit in us to convince us that we're loved and empowers us and enables us to see ourselves in relation to him. That's what Paul's talking about. Can I get the worship team to come up? It's another morning where I feel like the Father wants to do business. We're not orphaned children who lack the tenderness of a caregiver that leads us to broken relationships, that leads us to depression and anxiety. One of the primary findings of Renee Spitz's study was how difficult orphan children, the difficulty they had in forming relationships and maintaining relationships with other children. That's not our narrative anymore. That's not our story anymore. It might have been our story, but it's not our story anymore. Because he's given us something totally different. He's won the victory. He came and he did it. He's the one who died that you might receive the inheritance, his Spirit, promising the goodness and love and tenderness and affection. He actually tells Timothy, hey, I know you had a good grandma and you had a good mom, and I know you're a good man because of that. Remember the people, he's basically saying this, remember the people that came before you that poured into you. That's one facet of dealing with the orphan spirit. Remember that God has given you good people to pour into you. He tells Timothy to fight the good fight by reminding himself about the prophetic promises that have been spoken over his life. How do we deal with the orphan spirit? We remind ourselves what the Father said about us. So what's the Father like? How has he come to us? He's given us people to pour into us. He's spoken precious promises over us. He's used other believers to speak into your life. Remind yourself about those things. Fight the good fight. When that orphan wants to come up, go, I'm not an orphan. I don't form a gang and then kill other people. I don't lob grenades from one side of the church to the other. I don't pull out my AK-47 and try and shoot them so they know I'm right. That's not me anymore. Right? But that is us if our system is an angry God that punishes the unbeliever. If our system is that, we become orphans. Because we go right back to that place of fear. But as the Father comes and corrects our view of him, that's not who I am. That's not who I ever was. People have misappropriated what the Father's like. Teachers have, and for that I'm sorry. I've done it in the past, and for that I'm sorry. I believe the Father wants to encounter us this morning. That he wants to come in these places where we've been enculturated, where culture has formed an unhealthy expectation of what a spiritual leader is like because that gets imputed to God. Our family has given us broken pictures of what a father or mother is like. Our theological systems have misrepresented what the Father's like. So this morning as I was praying about this, I felt like the Lord said that he wanted to meet us in those three areas. Where culture's formed an unhealthy thing, God goes, I want to come in there and show them what I'm like. Where family's formed an unhealthy picture, I want to come in here and I want to show you what the Father's like. Where theology has formed an unhealthy picture, I want to come and show you what I'm actually like. So if you could stand with me. And if there's anybody on ministry teams that are available, we're just going to make this, you don't need to come up. I don't want a formal, team line or anything like that. Just want to create the space this morning to refresh what the Father is like, because we forget every day. It's the easiest thing to forget what he's like. And I feel like this morning he wants to remind us. So for any of you that had broken fathers and broken families, the Father wants to visit you this morning. For any of you who grew up in a church that told you God was always angry with you and you had to watch out for the punishing rod, the Father wants to visit you this morning. And for those of you that are just starving for a touch, I don't know where he went. He wants to visit you this morning. He's here. And so this space we're dedicating to encounter with the Father, that we might be refreshed and renewed again, that we are adopted children, we're no longer orphans, that fear doesn't tell us the narrative, but his affection tells us the narrative, that our story is his story, and he's empowering and enabling us to remember ourselves in light of him and how good he is. So if you want to encounter the Father, come. This space is for that. If you can be dismissed. If you guys need to go, have a great Sunday. If you want to have conversations, please take them to the foyer. But we're going to just dedicate this space this morning. If you want to encounter the Father, come. Come.